In this video, I want to turn to section 3. So we're still in the theory of justice. We're still in the first part, part 1, namely theory. We're still in chapter 1, justice is fairness. We're now doing section 3, the main idea of the theory of justice. Rawls now states explicitly that he aligns himself with the social contract tradition. And the social contract tradition has a number of characteristics to it. It basically advocates founding societies based on some kind of morals by agreement. So morality is essentially something that's chosen. And what Rawls wants to do is specify under the conditions under which this morality is chosen. And that's very important. So one thing that we're doing here, says Rawls, is we're getting rid of the notion of moral principles as sine a priori. They will be chosen, they will be debated and discussed under certain conditions. So it's not something, totally just natural, we stumble upon them. No, we actually invent and we cook them up and we come to agreements over them. So it's arguably a fairly naturalistic form of ethics, at least in the sense that there's no metaphysics involved. Okay, so you don't literally have to have people sitting around choosing these things. It's a thought experiment in the abstract. This is what people would choose under the certain conditions that Rawls will specify, and I'll talk about those in a bit. So what are we really talking about? Well, Rawls says that the principles of justice, as I said, are chosen. Who chooses them? Well, under certain conditions. They are chosen by free, rational, self-interest, and this notion of a free, rational, self-interested individual, this has long been in a model of what the individual is when it's like economists have used this kind of a model for a long time. They call it, and they even call it rational choice. And Rawls does say specifically, if you read closely, he says specifically that he wants to specify his choosers, his rational agents, in this way so that he can take advantage of the ideas that have come out of what's called rational choice theory. And look for a video on that from me as well. But I'm not going to go really into rational choice theory here. So Rawls is building on a lot of work that's done before him. And he alludes to this in various places, and other philosophers that we'll look at as we dig more deeply into this chapter. Okay, so principles of justice, they don't come from heaven or anything like that. They're not just sort of natural or anything. They're selected by sort of like it's a committee. You can think of it that way. It's justice as by committee. And so people do come to some kind of an agreement. And but what's important is that the people are ignorant. That is, there is a veil of ignorance. We'll talk a little bit about that. But just roughly, when the people are deciding what kind of justice, what concept of justice, namely the principles that will constitute the concept of justice, when people are picking the rules of the game, think of it this way. They're setting up the rules of the game, and you don't know what position you'll be in that game. Right? So in other words, when you're setting up the rules of the society and that is the justice that will govern the society, when you're in this situation, you're self-interested. Yeah, sure, you want the best for yourself, but you don't know who you'll be. You don't know, what group you'll belong to, how wealthy, what you'll look like, male, female, and you'll know nothing about yourself, right? What community of any kind. I mean, there's so many different ways you can talk about communities in the world now. I just gave an example of a couple, but there's all different kinds. Rawls says, let's bracket all that, right? As a phenomenologist might say, we'll bracket all this notion of your identity, right? Put that as much to the side as possible and just have this simply, you're not being coerced. You're rational in the sense of you make decisions logically. You don't make them randomly. You make them arguably logically, and that's what there's that rational choice theory coming in. So again, there's a lot of stuff that's packed into here. You're self-interested, so, and as Rawls says, you don't have like moral interests. You're interested in getting the best for yourself. It's not that you're evil and you want to crush anyone else, but you want to get the best for yourself. But who is yourself? You don't really know. right? So because you're ignorant, you're behind this veil of ignorance, so you don't know when you step out of the room. Like to use a very simple example, you don't know if you're going to step out of that room and be wealthy or poor. So you wouldn't necessarily say, if you're really rational, that you're going to say, oh, I might be rich, and so I don't want to have any taxes on rich people or something like that, or I might be poor and I want lots of benefits or whatever. Well, you could be the opposite of those, but you have to live under the system. So careful what you vote for, says Rawls, because you have to live under it. Sometimes Rawls refers to them agents or actors. So just for the sake of clarity in these videos, these are choosers, deciders, or agents, or actors, whatever. It doesn't matter. Okay, so under this in this thought experiment of this veil of ignorance, that this, shall we say, this sort of fundamental committee of people, the Justice Committee, sort of like a little Justice League, they're going to decide what, as a group, what justice is, constitution, right? Constituting the concept of justice. What will they pick, right? Rawls, he spends a bit of time musing about this, and he says, what are they going to pick? And he says something like this. He doubts very much. He wants to make the case for this, and he will try to do this in the book. So he's just laying out a bunch of things at the beginning here, and the rest of the book. Remember, it's large. There's lots of time for him to make it to flesh the case out. But here he's just sort of stating the case. This is the argument for the case. What Rawls thinks is that it's not the case that they're going to pick something like the principle of utility. If you get a group of people together under these circumstances, right, this sort of, free, rational, self-interested, ignorant, under the veil of ignorance, they're not going to pick a principle like the principle of utility. And Rawls says something like, if someone presented to this group, that, hey, everybody, sometimes we should be diminishing life prospects for some in favor of a greater sum of advantages for others, Rawls thinks, and he'll try to make the case that people under this thing would say, why would I do that, right? So there is, in Rawls' view, that people would not really accept principles of justice that you can justify, arguably, in other frameworks. Its main target is utilitarianism. That you could barter away, that you would say, in this future society that I'm about to step into, any right that I may have could be bargained or bartered or taken away from me and handed over to some other group. And that would be justified. That would be actually just to do that. Rawls doesn't think you'd agree to that. You just know. You would say, no. If that's what that society's like, I'm not going. In that sense, Rawls is saying something like this, and this will come out more clearly when he says what kinds of principles they would choose. Is people would be hesitant. They would say, no, not just anything can be bargained or bartered or taken away or in a just way. I mean, it may happen, but if certain things, there would be certain things that I want as an individual in that society, such that if they were taken away, that would be an injustice. That wouldn't be an application of justice. As Rawls thinks, the principle of utility can sometimes take away certain very fundamental things in order to achieve balances or to maximize the good. Basically, Rawls thinks that people would reject principles of maximization of good. In other words, this is why he's a deontologist and classified as one, although those are kind of slippery terms, and Rawls will chafe sort of at the traditional notions of how to define deontological. But Rawls certainly is okay with consequentialist forms of thinking. He does say that anybody who doesn't take into account consequences at all, that's pretty well insane to do that. But nonetheless, that doesn't make him a strict consequentialist, and he does not think that that certainly he wouldn't agree that the right should be defined in terms of maximizing a good. The right is fundamental. The right is something that, as we saw with Ross, that the right and the good are different concepts, and you shouldn't try to define the right in terms of the good. So in that sense, Rawls lines up with Ross, who eventually, of course, lines up with the great deontologist of all time is Immanuel Kant, right? But Rawls certainly isn't anti-consequentialism in the way that Kant is. But Rawls certainly does not like the notion of a utilitarianism, which is a consequentialism plus a maximizing principle. He doesn't like that idea, and he doesn't want to explain the right in terms of a good of some type. No, and we'll see this in Rawls's principles, that the principles that would be chosen by the choosers under the veil of ignorance. So again, there's a little bit of hand waving as to why Rawls thinks that under this beginning state, it's not a state of nature, and I'll talk a little bit more about what Rawls thinks is going on here, because he will call this the original position. Anyways, and as opposed to the initial situation, we got to distinguish those a bit. But Rawls does say that, I'll just make a couple of notes on this, just so you think about this. As I said, Rawls wants to take advantage of certain economic theory, namely rational choice theory. He says that, you could start your philosophy, and this is a line of attack on Rawls in the sense that you might disagree with Rawls right at the basis, and many critics have, right at the very foundation of his system, because the foundation of his system is that this is what's doing the deciding, right? These are the deciders. There are these kinds of individuals. So they get really stripped of their identities. Now, as I said, today, we're very concerned with identities, and it's not surprising that a lot of people react to Rawls right here and say, what are you doing? You're kind of making them out like they're little ghosties, and you're stripping them of all content. And what do you mean by this? Again, Rawls did it for reasons of trying to take advantage of rational choice theory. He's very explicit about that. However, he's not very clear about it at the beginning of the book. But if you go way to the back, right to the tail end of the book, and as I say, always read, as one professor of mine used to say millions of years ago when I was an undergraduate, always read into the back parts, the dark back parts of a text, because sometimes authors will tell you things that they didn't tell you when they should have up front. Rawls does admit, I think, what is it, section 8, something wild, like section, something like 87 or something, section 87, way at the back of the book, he says that, maybe if all the free participants had strong, if you want to build in, benevolent impulses, they might pick the principle of utility, right? So if you say, like people are going to sit down and they're going to go, under some cases, I can see that I would give up, everything to maximize some kind of good, and basically I would give all my rights away, and I would regard that as an example of justice if everything were taken away in some kind of circumstance, that it's in principle possible to justify it. Rawls doesn't think that really captures what free individuals are. But nonetheless, he admits that he'll have to go into this in some more detail. Now, this is important, this concession that Rawls admits that there's different ways to formulate the thing right at the beginning. This opens up a distinction that Rawls isn't always clear on. And that's between the initial situation and the original position. We'll see more on it, but now think of the initial situation as kind of like a genus. You could have the initial situation as like the beginning situation, and different ways that you interpret the initial situation will give rise to a very specific one. Rawls interprets the initial situation in a very particular way, and he gets this, right? He calls that the original position. So the initial situation is kind of like a genus concept, if you like, and you could have different starting points. The Rawlsian starting point is the original position. Now, he wants to tell a story as to how he gets to the original position from the initial situation. He thinks you do have to make the argument. So he's going to try and make a case for this as well, which will lead us into some of his famous ideas. So different philosophers in this tradition, in the social contract tradition, you can think of it this way. They all start with this genus concept of the initial situation, and they come out with different starting points. So Hobbes has one, and a variety of them have different kinds of views, Rousseau and whatnot. But then again, be careful because sometimes people want to split up and start talking about contractarians and constructionists or whatever. But basically, you can have different ways of starting off. Rawls has his particular way. So not everybody in this tradition starts in the same way that Rawls does. That's an important point, right? So just because you don't like the way Rawls starts, that doesn't take you out of the social contract tradition per se. It takes you out of a Rawlsian version of it. So keep that in mind. That's important. You think you might be attacking the whole genus, but you're actually just hitting a species of it. Rawlsian thought is one species in this larger organism that we call social contract theory or the social contract tradition. So you could insist that there are benevolent feelings, and you start off with a different kind of, shall we say, a different committee. So you wouldn't have Rawls's original position. You might have the friendly committee of original beginnings, and they're not necessarily completely self-interested. Maybe they're other interested as well. And so lots of criticisms of Rawls, excuse me, have been like that, where they start from a different interpretation of the initial situation, so they don't quite get this. So keep that in mind. So now, what we want to look at is, okay, so Rawls has a specific thing. Go back to this question. Well, okay, if they're not going to pick that, what exactly will they pick? Stay tuned.